I'm head and curator of the center. I am delighted to speak with you on the beginning of the second biennial Barry Lawrence Ruderman Conference on Cartography, this one focusing on the intersection between gender, sexuality, and maps. But before I go on, I would like to introduce Mimi Coulter, Deputy University Librarian, who would like to say a few words of welcome to the attendees. Mimi.
Hi, everybody. Thanks very much. I am very happy to welcome you all here to the David Rumsey Map Center, both on behalf of me and of Michael Keller, our university librarian, who is unable to be here today. So welcome to the second biennial Barry Lawrence Ruderman Conference on Cartography. The Stanford Libraries are really thrilled to be able to host this event. We're particularly pleased to be able to host it in this facility. One of the key elements of this that we had in our vision for the Map Center, even before it opened, when we were just planning it, was the capacity to hold conferences. We were really looking to bring together scholars, with other experts, to support them with all kinds of resources, from technology to staff to content that would allow them to do amazing things. Conferences, we wanted to support classes, we wanted to support general research, but conferences are, of course, a big piece of what we had envisioned going on in the space. And I think this conference is a great example of just basically a demonstration that we were able to achieve our success in that goal. Today we are bringing together a diverse set of 16 speakers covering what I think is a really fascinating topic of the interaction of gender, sexuality, and cartography. In addition to being fascinating, it's also timely, given some of the discussions and things we see in the news and discussions that I know I'm having on a day-to-day basis. We expect to have more than 100 attendees over the course of the conference, which is very exciting. I'm happy to say that 32 of them are students, and we were particularly thrilled to have students here and be part of the discussion and conversation. It is my particular honor to thank our chief sponsor and host, Barry Lawrence Ruderman. It's his efforts that I want to thank him generally for his work making his maps available, and I know electronically. I know Salim is going to have more to say about that. But Barry really is a longtime friend and supporter of the Stanford Libraries. We thank him for his support very much for this event. We thank him for being one of the founding friends of the David Rumsey Map Center. And even within the small circle of founding friends, Barry was one of the first engaged. So we really do appreciate his support of the overall concept and the event itself. And for his ongoing support of events like this. Having thanked Barry, I also very much want to thank David and also Abby Rumsey for their continued support. Thank you. So thank you very much to all three of you. I really do look forward to an interesting and engaging event over the next couple days, and look forward to meeting with many of you and talking through some of the concerns and issues that get raised. I am going to hand it back to Salim, but I wish you all a very good conference.
Thanks, Mimi. So, as Mimi mentioned, our connection with Barry Lawrence Ruderman predates well before the opening of the center. We partnered with him to create a digital collection of maps several years prior to 2016. And I'm happy to say that this collection, with an initial set of 20,000, continues to grow with selected gems that become part of his digital collection here at Stanford. So you can see over here the collection. It is a digital-only collection. And right now we have over 23,000 items. And then just an example, some of the examples. Here's one from the collection, John Bull and His Friends by Fred W. Rose. Picked this for, we thought it was pretty apropos for this particular conference. As you can see, a really good resolution. Fantastic resource for our students, this one being quite political as well. So it's that being said, In addition, Barry Lawrence Ruderman is as Mimi mentioned, a chief sponsor of this ongoing biennial conference, which allows us to interrogate themes such as gender, which usually appear on the edge of historic and rare cartography, pushing the cartographic envelope, as it were. We hope to continue on this track and plan on focusing the next conference on indigenous cartography in 2021. Clearly, the Academy is a winner in all of this, and for that, the Center thanks Barry profusely for his generosity, and we hope to continue this fruitful partnership. Thanks too to David and Abby Rumsey for their continued support, and to all those donors who continue to help us make the Center a vibrant place for cartography the world over. I turn next to introducing Katie Parker. Dr. Catherine Parker earned a BA in History and International Studies at Oregon State University, University's Honors College. She then studied at the University of Pittsburgh for her MA, 2012, PhD in History, 2016, where she specialized in the creation of Pacific geographic knowledge in the 17th and 18th centuries. Her area of expertise is in the early modern European history of cartography. Upon graduation, she was awarded an Hackett Society Research Fellowship. She has also held fellowships from the American Bibliographical Society, the John Carter Brown Library, and the Mellon Foundation. She was also elected as a Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society and is currently the administrative editor of the Hackett Society, which specializes in the publication of primary sources for the history of global exploration. Katie is Barry Lawrence Ruderman Antique Maps Research Officer, and today most importantly, she's here as a co-organizer of this conference. The theme of this conference is really her brainchild, so I'm excited to have her speak to you all about it. And so without further ado, Katie Parker.
Thank you for that rather august introduction for just what's going to be a very little talk. Two administrative notes before we move on. I'm not sure if everyone knows yet, but I don't think anyone knows yet because it's a bit of a new thing. HNet Common is an online listserv network for people involved in the historical community that apprises people of book reviews and events and things. There's going to be a brand new list, which is H Maps. So if you're interested in maps at all, you can subscribe through HNet Commons, and there's going to be everything on there. I am the book reviews editor of said list, and one of the first things I would like to commission would be someone to review this conference for then publication online. So if anyone who's going to be attending most of the sessions would like to write a review, it doesn't need to be long or it doesn't need to be Ulysses or anything like that. Would you just contact me in the reception or at some time today, and we can talk about how that's going to go. Second, we are social media friendly for this conference. So we have our hashtags up here. So if you want to put us on Instagram, if you want to, whichever social media platform is your preferred, please do give us a larger presence for people who couldn't actually be in attendance here but would like to know all the things that are going on. With that, I would also like to echo Salim's welcome and his thanks to Barry Ruderman for his sponsorship and support, the Rumseys and the Center for hosting and co-organizing the event, and all of you for attending what I hope will be an important conference on this topic. The conference aims to understand the intersections of gender, sexuality, and cartography. We have academics, artists, and activists, categories that are not mutually exclusive, from several disciplines to share how maps reinforce, reflect, shape, and challenge gender scripts and sexual norms, both historically and in our contemporary lives. This conference comes at a time when gender and sexuality are at the forefront of national and global current events. The Supreme Court this week heard arguments about whether or not it is legal to fire someone for being gay or transgender. It was the first time the words transgender and cisgender have appeared in a Supreme Court argument. A 16-year-old Swedish girl is leading the fight against climate change, and her gender is but one of many things that critics have latched onto in order to criticize her power and standing on the global stage. In a Me Too world where many universities have women's and genders and sexuality studies, or some mix of those three words, studies programs, it may be surprising for some, and it will be utterly unsurprising for most, that gender and sexuality remain largely absent from the history of cartography. At the most recent meeting of the International Conference on the History of Cartography, the largest and most prestigious event within the History of Maps community, held this year in Amsterdam in July, not one of the 105 papers focused on gender and sexuality. Only one focused on women. In the interest of full disclosure, my paper at said conference also did not focus on gender or sexuality. Since the mid-1980s, the history of cartography, now increasingly known as the history of maps and mapping, has undergone a revolution of sorts, as did many historical fields. The sociocultural critique has changed the way that we investigate mapping and map objects. Maps are seen as mediated objects, the products of complex social, cultural, economic, and political contexts that reveal nuanced power relationships and networks. While there has been important work completed on female map makers and map users, research that will be well represented at this conference, there is much left to explore, particularly for female mappers in non-Anglophone contexts, for example. Beyond the role of women in mapping, there is much left to learn and sources left to examine and, importantly, re-examine in order to better understand how masculinity, femininity, gender presentation, queer identities, sexual orientation, gendered language, and other topics inflect upon and interact with maps and mapping. The conference is but one step in the widening the research on these topics. I hope that the conversations that we begin over the next few days lead to more questions, papers, works of art, and ideas as to the historical and artistic geography and cartography of gender and sexuality, as well as the gendered and sexualized nature of maps as objects. And with that, I'm going to turn back over to Salim, who's going to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thanks, Katie. So yes, on to the main event, our keynote speaker. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Susan Schulten. Susan Schulten is Professor of History at the University of Denver. Her newest book is A History of America in 100 Maps, published by the University of Chicago Press and the British Library Press. She's also the author of Mapping the Nation, History and Cartography in 19th Century America and the Geographical Imagination in America, 1880-1950, both with the University of Chicago Press, and a co-editor of Constructing the American Past, a source book of People's History, this is 2018, with Oxford University Press. Professor Schulten received her BA from the University of California at Berkeley and her doctorate from the University of Pennsylvania. Some of her recent work includes map drawing, graphic literacy, and pedagogy in the Early Republic History of Education Quarterly 2017 in the journal History of Education Quarterly, the Civil War and the Origins of the Colorado Territory, published in the Western Historical Quarterly, which was awarded the annual prize for Best Article to appear in the journal. Emma Willard and the Graphic Foundations of American History in the Journal of Historical Geography, this is 2007, and Barack Obama, Abraham Lincoln, and John Dewey, the DU Law Review, that's 2009. Professor Schulten teaches courses on Lincoln, the Civil War and Reconstruction, America at the turn of the century, the history of American ideas and culture, the Great Depression, the Cold War, and the presidency and the methods and philosophy of history. In 2010, she was named a Fellow of the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation. In 2013, the Pacific Coast branch of the American Historical Association awarded Mapping the Nation the Norris Hunley Prize for the most distinguished work of history published in 2012, written by a scholar living in the American and Canadian West. In 2017, she was awarded a Public Scholar Fellowship by the National Endowment for the Humanities. She is the author of a series of 19 articles for the New York Times Disunion series, which commemorated the sesquicentennial of the American Civil War, and a shorter series on the relationship of maps in history for the New Republic. Recently, she was awarded a Public Scholar Fellowship by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Susan is by no means a stranger to the David Rumsey Map Center. She was an invited speaker during the opening of the center in 2016, and then again as a speaker for the Time and Space Conference in November of 2017. She returns today as the keynote speaker for our second Ruderman conference. Without further ado, Susan Schulten and her talk, Map Drawing and Female Education in the Early Republic. Join me.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I'm going to roam a bit. I'm delighted to be here. I want to make sure I thank the right people first. There are so many people behind the scenes that have made this conference go smoother than any conference I have ever been a part of. So please join me in thanking not just Salim and Katie Parker, but also the people who put together the wonderful exhibits around you, Deirdre Fizell, TJ Cruzada, who's done all the AV, Rayun Wang, who's done a lot of the digital work, and anyone else who I didn't mention. Of course, I want to join my colleagues in thanking Barry Ruderman, who you can tell if you didn't already know him from the introductions. Barry is a force to be reckoned with, and I see you. I've spoken a lot over the last few years about what I call this complicated ecosystem that exists in the history of mapping. And I'm talking particularly about dealers, collectors, scholars, and archivists. And as Katie Parker said, many people occupy more than one of those categories. The things that David has done for the history of mapping, not just as an informed dealer, right, but as someone who has edged deeply into scholarship and has hired great minds like Katie to help support his work, is truly astonishing. And I want to say it's not just because of him that my work is richer, it's because of him that people like me can do work at all, because we really are existing very much at the pleasure of the trade that has produced and brought so much material to light that we wouldn't otherwise know of. So I'm deeply grateful for what Barry has done in the 10 years that I've been involved in this community. Need my water. Most important to me today is that I recognize two people who have been paramount influences over my work in the history of mapping. And it turns out there's an important anniversary that we're celebrating right now, but only 3 of us are celebrating it. It was exactly 10 years ago that I wrote a letter to David and Abby Rumsey when the map collection was not yet here, but in the very elaborate basement of their home in San Francisco. I was finishing up a book on the history of thematic mapping, or maps of information. And on a very, very long shot, I wrote them a letter to ask if I could come visit their collection. David and Abby's particular concentration at the time and where they were most rapidly collecting was in an area that was very dear to me, and that was the transformation of mapping in the 19th century. And not only did they respond and say yes and invite me to come, I spent a glorious day with them going through what was absolutely a treasure trove for me. And that visit changed the course of that research and the book that became Mapping the Nation. And at the end of that day, David very excitedly pulled me aside to show me his newest treasure. And it's that treasure and the history that put me on and the rabbit hole that this sent me down that will explain how we get to that. So I'll bridge that connection for you in just a minute and over the next several minutes. What David had acquired in 2009 was something that we thought at the time was kind of a one-off. It was a penmanship journal by a young woman who identified herself as Frances Henshaw. Her book of penmanship, executed at the Middlebury Female Academy, April 29th, 1823. But for many years, David and I thought that was 1828. It turns out it's 1823. This matters, trust me. And what follows is several pages of very, very carefully constructed information through penmanship, right? And we thought it was such a glorious example, but we didn't know the tradition that it came out of, right? We were just taken with the images. And in page after page, Frances Henshaw artfully arranged information in a way that, as we would come to understand, was to help her memorize it, right, in a way that some have said evokes quilt work or piecework of the 19th century. After that long series of pages on information, she turns to her maps, both literal maps, and here I chose Maine because our guests, Matthew Edney and Libby Bischoff, are here, and they enjoy these materials as well. And also, of course, if you know your history, you know we're coming up on the 200th anniversary of Maine statehood, which is also the beginning of the sectional crisis. So bad things happen. But the good thing is we're celebrating this history. And Frances Henshaw drew literal maps like this, paired with word maps like this. Maine, bound north by Canada, east by New Brunswick, south by the Atlantic, west by New Hampshire. Other ways of organizing information spatially that her teachers were helping her to think about in a way that would help her memorize that information. Okay. Over time, it became clear to me, after David showed me this, that the more I would look, the more I would find examples like this, right? And David had in his own collection, not just a phenomenal cache of Emma Willard's published material, but also the several manuscript maps that became increasingly important to me as I began to see that Emma Willard came out of a world of very intense graphic visualization that stretch across the United States in the years after the Revolution. And that's what I want to turn your attention to. This tradition of map drawing that I'm going to pay attention, that I'm going to focus on for the next few minutes, has a long history, of course, and it's not exclusive to women. For hundreds of years, school children in Europe and the British Isles had made maps, stitched, embroidered, painted, drawn. What's unusual and what I want to convey to you here is the way that because this tradition comes to the colonies at a very particular moment, it has an outsized influence over the way American women, in the first generation to be educated outside the home, experience geography. So here we have an example that we believe to be drawn in the British Isles, a general atlas done by Frances Bowen under the care of her sister Eliza in the year 1810. And in the British Isles, most of the examples that we have are from well-to-do families that had a tutor or a sister educating the young woman in question, right? What we'll see as that tradition goes into the colonies is that things shift a bit. Part of the reason that map drawing and map execution has such a long and rich history for women and women's education is this. As a very well-known atlas maker in 1818 wrote, geography is a study that is so universally instructive and pleasing that it has for nearly a century been taught even to females, right? He says this, of course, with an entirely straight face. And it's information like this that's absolutely gold to me, because it helps to explain why geography and maps have such a viral spread through the early years of American formal female education. Geography is appropriate as grammar and mathematics. It is a pathway to literacy. It is an entree to polite society. And especially in the years after the Revolution, it takes another form that I think is so crucial. Forgive the resolution here, but I think this is critical. This was sent to me by a researcher in London a few years ago who shares my love of these maps. It's a page from the Massachusetts Spy, or the Worcester Gazette, from 1788, right? The period of ratification. What I want to draw your attention to in this account of a grand procession, a parade to celebrate, right? New Hampshire's ratification of the Constitution. And it tells all the entrees into the parade. And then we have this. The terrestrial globe, rectified for New Hampshire and decorated by a company of young ladies who are in the study of geography, carried by two lads in uniform. In the decoration, each state was distinguished, New Hampshire in the zenith for its decision to ratify, Rhode Island on the western horizon in mourning, because as you know, Rhode Island did not ratify the Constitution. In any event, what I want to draw your attention to here is that timing and context that I mentioned a few minutes ago. This tradition of map drawing comes to the colonies, but in the decades after the Revolution, we see a turn toward expecting women to be educated not just in the home, but more urgently outside the home in formal settings. Because after the Revolution and with the creation of a new nation, women become responsible not just for raising their families, but becoming guardians of a civic tradition, right? What historians call a new tradition of Republican motherhood, guardians of a kind of civic education. And so geography comes to carry that weight. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is the public dimension of this. In other words, the maps and the globes that these young women are creating in the decades after the Revolution are meant to be seen. They are performed. They are public. And you'll see that in part that's why that these maps take on the appearance that they do. Here's just a few examples. Here we have one from David's collection. This is a private collector outside of Boston, another private collector who loaned his materials to the Leventhal. And then here we have one that's now in the Clements Library. There's many things that I could point out about this, but just at this stage, notice a few things. Many of them are framed or on rollers, right? These were cumulative projects that took hours and hours of a young woman's care and imagination and self-discipline. And as a result, lucky for us, that means that their descendants generally took good care of them. Even if they were benignly neglected in the attic, right? You can see evidence of the way that they carried a level of importance in the family, right? All of that give us some insight and some clues as to the way people thought about these projects. The other thing I'll have you notice is that they fall into categories or genres. Very, very commonly, and this would have been true in the British Isles as well as the United States, you see those on the double hemisphere, right? The earliest of these are stitched, and we actually have patterns for embroidery that they were based upon. Later, they become watercolors, right? Or pen and ink. But you'll see patterns of sameness that also indicate the kind of geography that they were exposed to. The places where these become most deeply entrenched are both the most established female seminaries and academies, but also the hundreds and hundreds of them that are started by young women in the room of their family's home and may last just 1 year. One of the only areas that women could expect to earn a living in the early part of the 19th century was through education, through homeschooling, right, as a preceptress for a small academy or a small seminary. In fact, that's how Emma Willard gets her start at age 18 when she opens her first school in Vermont. And yet there are far more established schools that also adopt this idea that central to a curriculum is map drawing or map execution or map construction as it was understood. The gold standard for these schools is started by Sarah Pierce in 1792. So think about the date again, immediately after ratification of the Constitution and the creation of the new nation. Sarah Pierce in Litchfield, Connecticut, starts the Litchfield Female Academy. And I apologize for the poor resolution here, but I just wanted you to see the certificate of graduation where you have the young woman blessed by enlightenment, right, with the text in her right hand and the globe at her left hand. You can see the path before her. And then I'll read you just the wording. Miss Seymour has completed with honor the prescribed course of study, grammar, geography, history, etc. But notice how central geography is. Geography wasn't only or always map drawing. Often it was very, very highly textual. But for many of those early experiences outside the home in formal education, for women to access geographical knowledge was not just to look at a map, but to make a map, right? And it's the result of those, or the legacy of those, that gives us so much to work with here. I also draw your attention to the Litchfield Female Academy because of geography. The Connecticut River Valley is the epicenter of the movement to educate women outside of the home. It is the vortex of female education in the early 19th century. Let me just give you some data to put that in perspective. In the 18 teens, 9 schools were founded in Hartford alone. 6 of those 9 were exclusively for women. More generally, from 1790 to 1830 in the Connecticut River Valley, there were 182 female academies founded and 14 seminaries, all of which were exclusively for women. That geography is also important because in that vortex, at that epicenter where all these schools are being founded, those students who are educated there, many of them are then becoming teachers. And those teachers, if they don't remain in the Connecticut River Valley, are taking their experience of education elsewhere. And while there are textbooks in geography and mathematics and grammar, there are no textbooks in map drawing. Everything that you're going to see up here is a reflection of women bringing their own experience to new schools. And so as we collect more and more of these maps and as they surface in the trade, when we look at their style and pay attention to where they're from, we have one more piece of the puzzle of a much larger network that actually gives us a window onto the day-to-day lived experience of these women, the first generation to be educated outside the home. So I love these materials not because they're charming, they are that, right? They for many years have been collected as folk art. But as we see them in aggregate, we can say much more about women's education generally and how women were understood to be able to access geographic information. Here is a merit badge from that Litchfield Female Academy from 1802. I want to draw your attention to how they are awarding these. They are giving a merit badge. This is a culminating experience or competition at the end of the academic year. In general, Miss Julia Chittenden is considered the most deserving for whom the prize of merit is impartially adjudged. The maps, paintings, and other pieces submitted for inspection are an honor to the school, etc. This was typical. The Litchfield Female Academy was the most established, but in all these schools, right, in part to have the students exemplify their knowledge, to demonstrate what they had learned, again, publicly, right, they would have a kind of showcase at the end of the semester, the term, or the year, where people from the community would literally judge and evaluate their work. And maps were particularly attuned to that kind of evaluation. As I said, this practice begins in the decades after the Revolution. It reaches a zenith, I would say, in the 1830s, reflected in the curriculum guides that you can very easily access. Here's one from 1831 from the Boston Female Monitorial School, a very well-regarded school for young ladies. And you can see how common it is. Geography and map drawing was something that all but 8 of the students enrolled in. Right? It had become extremely common. Ironically, as print prices fall in the 1820s and 30s, and atlases for schools become cheaper and cheaper, the need to draw one's own maps correspondingly falls. And so part of what we have here is a golden age from about 1790 to the 1830s, where these materials explode, not just in the Connecticut River Valley, but all across the colonies and then the states. Thereafter, we see fewer of these examples, which in part shows us something about the shift in education more generally. I'll give you a few examples of these before I zero in on Emma Willard. Here's one from the Osher Map Library, made by a young woman, Emily Hill. Matthew Edney has done significant research on this map, and I'm glad it's blown up here because it actually is enormous. It's not this big, right, Matthew? But it's pretty big. And Matthew has spent a lot of time helping me understand this. You won't be able to see from where you sit, but if you look closely to the original, you can see that it's several different pieces of paper put together, right? And what Matthew and others have derived from that is the possibility that Miss Emily Hill was a teacher herself and created this map as a model for her students. But it is precisely in the mode that I want to draw your attention to. As I zoom in here, I want you to think about what the students who were emulating this map were thinking that they were doing. What was the pedagogical goal here? So if I zoom in first on the cartouche, Libby Bischoff is an expert, if you will, on the way in which the particular botanical reproductions appear on these maps. Lots of different flora that were very much a part of a young woman's polite education and scientific education in the early 19th century. A map of the United States of America. Look at the way she's used different hands there. Over and over again, what we see with these manuscript maps is that they're a way for young women to practice penmanship. And that's not exclusive to women. There are lots of examples of young boys drawing these maps as well, but they are a fraction of what we've found created by women. Penmanship was one of the most crucial skills that a young man or a young woman could acquire in the 19th century. Would have helped them whether they went into teaching or into business or into lots of other avenues. It was incredibly practical. And so it's no surprise that not just on the cartouche, but look at the map itself. This is really big. It's kind of hard for me to wrap my head around. Look, I'll draw your attention to a couple things. One is that notice that Miss Emily Hill has used different round and running hands for different pieces of geography. State names are one, right? Smaller areas are another. Look at how carefully and delicately she has rendered the hydrography as well as the topography, right? And the other thing I'll draw your attention to, if you look at the boundaries between states, the way in which she's used watercolor to approximate the look and feel of a published map, right? Once again, in a time when published maps were rare, commercially very difficult to acquire, when school atlases were non-existent, part of what these young women are being taught to do is to master and demonstrate their skills, not just in penmanship and art, right, but also execution. All of these things get bound together in the tradition of map production. I think I have. Yes, I do. Sorry. Did some late night switching with these maps. In the way that I showed you some of the double hemispheres that are so common, the other tradition that you see exploding in the 18 teens are maps of the United States. And there are two very good reasons for that. First and foremost, like I said, there are very few maps available, even fewer during the War of 1812. And so many of them are modeled on the very, very rare ones that are circulating through the United States. But secondly, in 1815, with the end of the War of 1812, the United States goes through a period of extended, I would say, patriotism, even jingoism, right? The feat of having defeated the British might see it a different way, but Americans understood themselves as holding their own in what they called the Second War of Independence. And that produced a wave of patriotism across the United States. And it's no surprise then that you see a little boomlet of these maps of the United States of America as expressions of that patriotism. One of my all-time favorite examples of this is by a young woman named Caroline Chester, who enrolled at that gold standard I told you about, the Litchfield Female Academy, in 1816, at the age of 15. So right after the War of 1812, she's a 16-year-old girl who was enrolled for the summer term at the Litchfield Female Academy. And this is what she produces by the end of that term. It's extraordinary. And I forgive you if it looks to you like a printed map, because what she based it on was what we call the Schulten and Kensit, or the Doolittle Map, which is this. It's almost mimesis, right? And lucky for me, Caroline Chester kept a record of her time at the Litchfield Female Academy. And she was pretty honest with herself. And so when she was spending hours and hours on this, here's what she's being taught to do, right? That's hers on the right. mimicking Schulten and Kensett's cartouche. And that mimicry extends to every aspect of the map, down to the tiny annotations on the western frontier. Okay, and so ask yourself, what is she being taught to do? Well, one thing she's being taught to do is to work alone and to stay busy, right? Idle hands, devil's workshop, all that kind of thing. And as John Pinkerton said, one of the things that map study can do, when it engages young women in the study of geography, it keeps them from idleness, frivolity, and gossip, right? It keeps them busy in those long hours. And keep in mind that we are still in the early stages of formal education for women. As someone who teaches college students for a living, right, I can understand this. How do we keep these young people occupied for a long school day? Schooling in the home may be a few hours, but as the school day grows longer, we have to think about the curriculum differently. And for all these reasons, I think map study and map production explodes. It's supremely adaptable. And here's what Caroline Chester has to tell us about it. In June, she says in her diary, Mary showed us her large map of Asia, which she had just finished, and one of the United States. They both showed how much persevering industry, joined with a large share of patience, will accomplish. July, drawing on my map. Early August, the morning was devoted to drawing on my map, an employment of which I'm very fond. Mid-August, worked on my map. You get the picture. Late August, wrote and drew on my map. I once heard a gentleman remark that he had seen patience advertised for sale. And if ever I have the pleasure of seeing him again, I will petition him to purchase me a large quantity, for I know no person who stands so much in need of it as myself. September, I am quite tired of drawing on my map. And who can blame her, right? With that level of detail. And for that reason, these maps were criticized by many. You're not really teaching young women to create maps at all. While boys are out surveying, understanding principles of geometry, girls are inside being taught, sometimes quite literally, to copy a map. And that's what I want to turn to now. All of this brings us back to Frances Henshaw and her penmanship journal. Not long after David and Abby acquired Frances Henshaw's penmanship journal, another one came up that he very wisely snapped up. Harriet Baker's Book of Penmanship and Maps at Mr. Dunham's School in Windsor, Vermont, March 1819. This was seismic for me. To find something so similar in form, undertaken at a different place. The Middlebury Female Academy, this will be important in a few minutes, was founded by Emma Willard, right, where she was there from about 1816 to 1821. So she's not there when Frances Henshaw was studying there, and that was a great disappointment to me because I felt like I had really made an important connection about Willard's early years as a teacher. But this got me thinking about something different, right? The more of those manuscript maps that I've been showing you that I looked for, the more that I found. And I found different styles that help us think about different networks, different regional patterns and models. But now we were finding penmanship journals. Not just one, but another, which meant that there might be more to find, right? And it turns out, while David had acquired Harriet Baker's Book of Penmanship a few years ago, on the East Coast, the Osher Map Library had acquired Catherine Cook's Book of Penmanship, done also at Mr. Dunham's School in Windsor, Vermont. So there's Harriet Baker, and now we have Catherine Cook. Catherine Cook is 1818, Harriet Baker is 1819. This is even more exciting for me, right? To see that there are traditions in place, and once again, there is no textbook from which they're working. These are teachers who are then taking those traditions elsewhere and instituting them with their students. So let me just show you a few things about it. The similarities go on and on, right? Using similar round and running hands for different pages. They're clearly following a model that their teacher has set. You see different forms of the penmanship. And then something else that I have noticed, and I know many of you are interested in these maps, you may have noticed it too. More often than not, when you see these maps, you look carefully, you will find spelling errors. And I'm speculating here, but it seems to me with such a demanding, exacting kind of disciplined exercise, a student can be forgiven for losing basics like how to spell. So state names are often misspelled. This is the first time I've seen a student misspell her own name, right? Which is sort of interesting. But you see it quite common, and to me, it speaks to the degree that they are being really taught to focus very much on execution, right? Whether it's execution of lines or penmanship. You can see this here, the way in which they're copying certain types of information with little delicate touches. And that brings me to something that really has captured my fancy lately, and that is Eliezer Huntington. Eliezer Huntington published the most widely used book of penmanship, textbook, right, that was available in the early Republic. The first edition is 1816. This is from the title page of the improved edition 3 years later. Eliezer Huntington is working in the Connecticut River Valley. In other words, he's coming up himself, surrounded by this culture of highly visual, graphic knowledge and an emerging class of female academies. So in some ways, the traditional way of thinking about this as a historian would be to think about Eliezer Huntington producing his textbook that students then use. And so there's no surprise that you see those styles. What I'm trying to say is if you push it a little bit further, and this goes for not just Huntington, but for Willard and others, the educators themselves are coming out of this graphic tradition. And it is the world of map drawing and graphic information in the Connecticut River Valley that produces someone like Eliezer Huntington to create these types of manuals. Okay, so if you pay attention to the way in which his material, his book is used, you can see that it's his that is the guide for the lettering. You can see these are just another example of those word maps that I showed you earlier, right, where students are being taught simultaneously to practice their penmanship, but also to arrange information spatially. So here they both have created word maps of the United States, bounded east by the Atlantic Ocean, south by Florida, etc. Okay? And then finally, that graphic information is apparent in the way they arrange information, not spatially, but in certain angles, again, to increase their ability to memorize. Memorization was the be-all and the end-all of early 19th century education, right? The trick was, how do we get there? How do we impress information onto the mind so it will stick? Right? And so you see these penmanship journals in service to memorization at the same time that the information is geographical. Right? All of this is being mixed up in this stew of 19th century pedagogy. Finally, I just want you to, you can see a kind of maybe half bored, half whimsical effort by a student to mix it up a little bit, where she's actually copying from Huntington's title page in her word map of Virginia, right? The information that you usually see here is coming straight out of contemporary geography textbooks, right? The visualization is what their teachers are teaching them firsthand, right, and directly. After you have these word maps, again, I just wanted to show you the similarities, even in schools that are separated by hundreds of miles, right? Which suggests to me that these teachers have been trained together and are taking their own models outward into a network, a growing network of education. But after all those word maps, they all turn to literal maps. And so here we have Henshaw, Baker and Catherine Cook, right, with their 3 maps of Connecticut. The level of exacting precision in these is absolutely remarkable. That alone blows me away. But the other things too, look at the way they're approximating commercial maps in the representation of the shoreline, right, or the borders that we talked about before. All of those things give you a sense of what was happening in the classroom with these individual long-term experiments. And it's precisely this, at the height of this practice in the 18 teens, that Emma Willard is rebelling against, and that helps us explain how something like that develops. I just wanted to show you, this is Harriet Baker up close, right? It's glorious. I mean, it's just so, I could look at these for a long time, which is good because I spent a lot of time looking at these. Remember back to Catherine Cook, right? Our friend at Mr. Dunham's school, and also our friend Caroline Chester. In 1816, she drew attention to the fact that drawing a map showed how much persevering industry, does that sound fun? Right? Learning is great. Joined with a large share of patience will accomplish. And so I was just so taken when Catherine Cook wrote on the inside cover of her journal, persevere, persevere, right? I don't want to read too much into this, but these are projects that are taking an enormous and outsized degree, not just of time, but of concentration, right? And that's exactly, like I said, what Willard is rebelling against. At the end of her life, she's remembering back to this moment when she took over the Middlebury Female Academy in 1816. And she said, then I began a series of improvements in geography, separating and first teaching what could be learned from maps, then treating the various subjects of population, etc., by comparing country with country, river with river, making out with the assistance of my pupils those tables which afterward appeared in her geography textbook, right? The detail here is not important. What's important is that this is a woman who becomes the most influential female textbook publisher of the 19th century. Her success is second only to Peter Parley. And I want to argue to you that it's the moment at which she takes over a school of her own, and she's frustrated by this kind of ornamental, artistic, excruciating tradition of map drawing, and she wants to do something different. She loves maps. She loves geography. She's obsessed with geometry, art, perspective, but she believes that this map drawing tradition that has dominated, particularly in the Connecticut River Valley, has it all wrong, right? And she goes about things a little bit differently. And the reason we know this is because of the map trade, because 2 years ago, an astonishing journal came onto the market. It went through 4 map dealers until it was finally housed in a private collector in New York, thanks to me, or thanks, not thanks to me, sorry, for which I am grateful. And let me take you through that. I had nothing to do with it. I cannot afford to be a collector, but I am grateful for those who have collected. Frances Henshaw executed hers in 1823. And what came up at market was Eliza Henshaw's journal, done at Miss Willard's school in 1816. And I was astonished because Eliza Henshaw is named by Willard, not just as one of her first students, but one of her best students. She's such a gifted student that Willard decides to begin teaching her what was then called philosophy of mind, right, or natural philosophy, and what she later calls the decision I made to begin introducing masculine studies was due to my students at the Middlebury Female Academy, because she thought they could handle it, right? Not just the traditional exercises of elocution and math and grammar, right? But science and logic and philosophy. So when I found that this had been placed in an archive, I immediately wrote to them. Took a long time to get everything sorted out. And I apologize that these are so poor. But this, to me, is an absolute gold mine, because what we have here is the geography journal of Emma Willard's first and best student, and the one that she maintains a relationship with and later hires to help her with that crucial atlas that comes out in a few years, and I'll tell you about that. So here's the introductory page to Eliza Henshaw's journal, and then we get quite quickly to the maps. The narrative is fairly standard, taken from contemporary geography textbook like Jedediah Morse. But unlike her younger sister, who has a fairly traditional education at the Middlebury Female Academy in the 20s, Eliza Henshaw under Emma Willard is doing things a little differently. It's important to get your penmanship right. It's important to draw maps, but understand and look at the way in which these are done freehand, right? What's important to Willard is that students understand geographical relationships, right? Not mimicry. And it's that tradition and that break, if you will, that Emma Willard takes in a different direction. I think I have one more page for you. Yep, to zoom in a little bit. You can see that precision is a little bit less important to her than the general understanding of geography. And here's the page of Italy, right? So you can get a sense of what her students are doing. Willard leaves the Middlebury Female Academy in 1821, extremely embittered and frustrated. Down the street, the new Middlebury College has opened, where she routinely sees, as she says it, boys with money whom my students outperform any day of the week. Keep in mind, those were college men. Hers were high school girls. But she's incredibly frustrated by the sexism she encounters in the Middlebury community at the college, and her failure to convince, most importantly, the state leaders of Vermont to fund female education. So in 1821, she leaves her job at the Middlebury Female Academy and goes next door to New York, where Governor DeWitt Clinton has agreed to fund her initiative to have a separate formal school for young women. That school, of course, becomes the Troy Female Seminary, which is now known and still very, very well admired as the Emma Willard School. Okay? So that's the reason she leaves. She's deeply frustrated by what we would now call sexism, right? She's also internalized a lot of very important ideas about gender separation, I would say. But what's chiefly discouraging her is the way that men and women are meant to occupy different areas of learning. Thanks to us, though, she also tells us what Eliza Henshaw meant to her. Eliza Henshaw goes on to help teach at the Troy Female Seminary. And Emma Willard also makes clear that it's her former students, and I think Eliza Henshaw is the chief one, who she hires to help execute the maps that make up her series of maps to Willard's History of the United States. I mentioned to you a few minutes ago that Willard is one of the most successful textbook authors of the 19th century. First, she collaborates with William Woodbridge in the 1820s to create ancient and modern geography textbooks. And then she is a patriot to her bones, and she turns her attention to a new subject, American history, which of course is a function of the Revolution. Prior to the creation of the United States, there was not a robust history of the colonies. There was a history of the crown, right, and a history of separate colonies and the families, and church history. But with the creation of a new nation, we have the need for something new, and that is a subject that will teach our young men and women a sense of identity. And Emma Willard creates one of the first textbooks of American history, and even more important for me, she then visualizes that history in a series of maps and hires her female students to help draw those maps. So here you have the title page, and then what is very important to me, that she frames this as the introductory map, and I've spent a lot of time on this particular map, because it's a map of what she calls Aboriginal wandering, right? It's the prehistory, if you will, right? The introduction to the main event, because she sees natives as occupying a place prior to human history, hence the term introductory map. But partly what's interesting here, and this is just an aside, is that this is an attempt to collapse time onto space. What she's referencing here are hundreds of years of movement on a single page, right? And that in itself is innovative for the time, representing movement and elapsed time on a single sheet. Then we get to the main event. Oh, sorry, this is just a zoom in where you can see her trying to represent migration. And then true American history begins with the land grants of 1578, which fail, but that doesn't matter to her. It matters because it's the first indication of English interest in the colonies that will eventually take root, even though Sir Humphrey Gilbert's colony failed, right? But again, she's trying to show through graphic, iconic sort of imagery how change happens, integrating space and time. There you go. What I would like to argue to you is that you get someone like Emma Willard precisely because of that long period of female education that's immersed in intensely visual and graphic culture. Emma Willard rebelled against that tradition, but it also is what drove her to appreciate the value of visual education. She spends the rest of her career, this being the opening, using graphic techniques like the one on the right to help students master chronology as well as geography, space as well as time. Okay, and I think I have one more example of that. I'll get to it in just a minute. One of the most revealing things I've learned about Willard is what her sister-in-law, an even better known educational thought leader in the early 19th century, Elmira Phelps, wrote about her. And it's absolutely admiring. We should take it with a grain of salt. But look at the way she describes her sister-in-law. In 1833, she looks back and says, "Within the last 15 years, the present method of teaching geography by maps has been introduced. For some time after geographies were accompanied with atlases, no attempt was made to teach the drawing of maps except in a laborious and unprofitable manner, which occupied weeks, even months, with little other advantage than that of giving to the pupil neatness of execution." She's referencing that long tradition of exacting maps that we've looked at. The method consisted of delineating maps upon paper, coloring and printing them. These maps have a very pretty appearance, but as they were often drawn by tracing on paper laid over the original, the mind of the pupil was too intent on the mechanical performance to think of the relative situation of place. A young lady, after spending 3 months at a boarding school, she must have known Caroline Chester, and having drawn and painted a map, was considered as well versed in geography, though in truth she might be almost as ignorant of the science as the unconscious material on whose surface her map has been delineated. She's as dumb as the paper on which she's drawing the map. This is scorching, and this is squarely directed at the generations of female seminary leaders and their curricula, which Willard and Phelps were rebelling against to try to open the curricula for women in different directions. She then extols the work of her sister-in-law, who introduced a new method of teaching geography through maps in Middlebury, 1816. She had no books, which contained her plan, and taught her pupils from her own manuscripts. She made great use of maps in every recitation. Right? So extolling the way that Willard has then marketed herself, right, as a departure from what's existing. And then it's fascinating to me that in the post-Civil War era, a new generation of educators will separate themselves from Willard as being hopelessly old-fashioned, focused on recitation and memorization, etc. What does all of this tell us? All this tells us the many, many ways that map drawing was crucial to an emerging female education in the 19th century. And like I said, part of this is timing. There is no fixed tradition of formal female education after the revolution. And so something like map drawing is so adaptable that it quickly spreads. All you need is a map for a student to copy. It doesn't take much. There's a very low threshold for entry. And that in part explains why you see map drawing at the most established female schools, as well as the fly-by-night academies. Last week, I found an advertisement for a female school opening on the Mississippi frontier in 1838, and central to the curriculum was what they called map construction, right? It can reach very far. Secondly, it's important to me that you understand, and here I am taking a leap, but I do believe that in this situation, given how fluid everything is, the practice of map drawing then influences the pedagogy that comes out of it. In other words, Emma Willard is just one example, and I found others. Here we go. Emma Willard was just one of several authors who began as instructors at these female schools and then go on to be textbook authors and educational theorists, if you will, or publishers. Joseph Emerson, who had been at the Byfield Female Academy and then Saugus, William Woodbridge, who had been at Gallaudet, etc., etc. Eliezer Huntington, as well as someone whose penmanship journal grew out, I believe, of this intense visual culture in the Connecticut River Valley. And finally, I want to turn not to the past, but to the present, and to put our eye back on the role that people like Barry and Abby and David have played in all this, as scholars, as thinkers, and as collectors. The more that we learn about these as they come up in the trade, like I said a few minutes ago, the more we can put the pictures, the pieces of the puzzle together. What you're looking at here is a map by Juliana Carpenter, executed in 1825. I realize it's not a great image or scan. And you can see some of the traditional things that she was practicing here, the traditional hemispheric model. But I'm going to draw you up toward two pieces of information. Embedded in those maps themselves are the clues to the daily lived experience of these women. Here she is. She had died, and her sister then placed it on here as a kind of sentimental memorial. But this, to me, is crucial. Miss Juliana Carpenter, a premium for composition, gold star, from her preceptress, her teacher, Caroline Hale. Caroline Hale had just come from Mr. Dunham's school, right, that we looked at earlier from Windsor, Vermont. And she then goes and quite literally as a young woman supervises the techniques of that next generation to come up. And so with that, I want to thank the people in this room, and there are quite a few of them, Libby Bischoff and Matthew Edney and Judith Tyner and David and Abby, who have paid attention to these, Tom Hall at the McLean Collection. The people who have noticed these and begun collecting them have created a movement around these images so that now they have themselves become valued. When they come up on market and in the trade these days, chances are they'll be snapped up and put into an archive. And that is something that simply wouldn't have happened 30 years ago. So when I say that my work is not possible with people like David and Abby and Barry, I mean that quite literally, because it's only when we begin to pay attention to these as a genre that we can see them in aggregate and begin to extrapolate patterns based on the collection of more than just a few. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Susan. That was wonderful. I'm going to try and not have interference occur, so I'm going to go over here. We have time for a few questions, so if you could just put your hand up, I can come to you with the mic so that we can all hear. I will start. Do you have indications of...
I'm creating feedback.
I was like, that's why I'm trying to stay away from you.
Be. Oh,
it's fine. I like you a lot, but stay over there. What kind of indication You showed one really good example where you knew the base map they were copying from. For the double hemispheres, do you have a similar indication of where it was coming, which ones they were copying from, or is it whatever they could get their hands on that wasn't too expensive, probably?
Yep, and where is Libby? Libby and Matthew chime in here because they know quite a lot about these. Some of them were actual samplers, and they have, just like when I was growing up, there was the Butterick patterns that you could actually put on top and just sew through, and then the pattern disintegrated. So we don't have many of the patterns left, but many of the double hemisphere are quite common. They're fairly undetailed, you may have noticed. So many of these are not large, right? That students are not practicing tremendous geographic detail. They're practicing generalities of geography. Yeah. Do you want to add to that in terms of what they're modeling?
They're modeling. I mean, Matthew can talk about the maps that they're modeling. If you go, you have Hannah Comstock
I
next,
do. I'll
right?
go back. Yeah. And Hannah's right over here.
Hannah's
Many of the
over
samples
there.
I talked about, the artifacts are to the left.
We have Hannah at the Osher. We just bought her last year. Her map, not her. But one of the things that they're modeling, at least in what's around it, are samplers that are being done at the same time and embroideries. So at most of these academies that the women are going to, they're learning this. So Susan talked a lot about the visualization, but they're learning this in the larger context of sewing and embroidery and fancy work. And if you look at this map in particular, the way she outlines countries and continents especially, it looks like stitching. And it's totally intentional because that's the other work they're doing at the same time. We have a big show of this stuff up at our map library now until February if anybody wants to see it in context. But I hung them with a lot of embroideries from the same schools. So you really can see that the girls are taking patterns in a visual language from one medium into the other. And Susan, I just wanted to tell you violets, because there's violets at the very top of these, are loyalty, devotion, and faithfulness. So I think that's so much about the work that they're doing. So they're encoding these little messages that everyone in the 19th century would have understood. Right. And I think that's something we forget, this language of flowers and of the visual language. Even the way those bows were tied meant something, if they were tied left over right or right over left in the embroidery and in the mapping. And so this would have been speaking a language that anyone looking at them publicly would have understood at the time. And that meaning has been lost to a lot of us. So I appreciate you bringing it back.
Yeah, and I think if I have the last one, the traditions you can see here of mourning, right, of a soul effigy. There are other little clues that dealers and scholars like Libby have pointed me to that you see. Just little, right, here's your bow.
Yeah, the blue bows are everywhere. Once you start looking at them, you'll see them all over the place.
Right. I have much to learn. Yeah. Other comments or questions? We'll go here and then.
Wonderful talk. Just one comment. I was intrigued by your mentioning the spelling errors, and my early training was in calligraphy, and I can remember so often being so focused and immersed on the effort to create something beautiful that I had some embarrassing episodes and had to invent some ways of correcting my mistakes, cutting the errant letters out of parchment and pasting new ones in. So I really appreciated that.
Yeah, and that once again, I think that reveals something of the actual experience of what they're doing at the time, right? Where they're being taught to invest primarily in execution, right? Not always, but quite often. And you can see some of that in these examples too.
I just wanted you to go over that concept of busy work, where that the geography didn't mean anything in this case. Like, it's kind of relegating it to craft, not even artwork, like even lower than art. So can you go over that a little bit again?
Yes, and that is not me speaking. That's the educators in the 1830s distancing themselves from what we used to teach women. They begin to deride it as ornamental, which is actually the word that Sarah Pierce at Litchfield says, I want an education for my girls that is ornamental and practical, right? Both. But I think that's a way of for people like Willard and Phelps and others to say, well, we're not that, right? That's the old style of educating women. Part of my point is that it's that style that creates them, right, to take a visual education in new directions such as this. So I'm not saying it's busy work, but I do think that map production fits in a lot of ways when all of a sudden you've got young women to keep occupied for a very long period of time. I think there's a reason that map production goes viral. I want others who work on this to please correct me, but I think that that's part of why it fits. It's so adaptable. It's a pathway to science. It's a pathway to geography. It's polite, right? It's useful. It's practical. It's many things depending on how it is implemented, right? But what's interesting to me is that map drawing is both embraced by Willard and others, but they dismiss the way that their forebears did it. Do you see? Does that help? Yeah.
All right, we only have time for one more question, so it's going to go to Abby, and then I will make a couple announcements, so stay where you are.
Thank you. I'm still thinking about your comment that the men were out there surveying and the women were in there copying. And I'm wondering, this is purely speculation, but maybe you found some evidence of the effect that looking at so much of the world but never leaving their towns had on women. How did they imagine? I mean, did these maps actually change their imagination or understanding about the world in which they lived and how large it was?
Well, I do have a lot of theories about that. And Emma Willard, when she starts the Middlebury Female Academy in 1816, she makes a little speech, and I actually took that out for time. But she talks about the way that women are uniquely rooted and uniquely capable of understanding not just geography, but terrain and nationalism, because they are stationary, right? Men can roam, but women cannot wander. They must sink their roots where they are, or something like that, right? I think that that in part explains why she thinks geography is so appropriate for women, right? That it is this, it's a pathway to educate our future Republican mothers, and it's a way for young women who will never travel to understand that their fellow citizens are people they will never see. Do you see? And so part of, I haven't talked about it today, but part of the, I think, reason that maps like this proliferate in the teens and 20s when the country is so new is that they're trying to help young men and women, but particularly women, understand the meaning of national identity, right? It's invented. Overnight, you have to, people in the Carolinas have to have something in common with people from Massachusetts. And there's not that much they have in common, right? But maps are a way to bind the country together. It's an imagined nationalism, right? So I do think that that intersects with geography in several ways, but I'm not sure I can answer your question about how far to push that, right? Do you have ideas?
No. No, that's right. I mean, nationalism is something that's sort of invented in the 19th century, but it was really just a question of whether you've seen the effect it had on women's imagination. But we can talk about that in the reception.
Right, and I mean, one thing that's interesting is the women that I'm looking at who are students and then teachers, they go all over the place, right? They go where the jobs are. But that's not the experience of, I mean, the statistics are really powerful about how little people moved in the era before the railroads.
Excellent. And Abby actually already provided my perfect transition, but we can continue this discussion in the reception, which is right back downstairs. We'll have the elevator open, and then the stairs there lead you right into the Munger Rotunda, where we're going to have a reception. There will be time over the next 2 days to see the exhibition, which is around you, but I would like you tonight to focus on the exhibition bits that are actually downstairs, because we do need to close up the center here in a couple minutes. So if I could ask everyone to move downstairs, but first, can we thank our speaker once again?